Hey, John here. My neighbor bought an old foot pedal sewing machine table at a flea market and thought she could get me to put a new top on it and make it a nightstand. The base was cast iron and very heavy, and the top was a half moon painted haze gray. It was at this point I was having Navy flashbacks. But the cool thing about this table was that the foot pedal still functioned, and I caught myself playing with this function the entire day. So the first thing I did was remove the top to see if the wood was something worth salvaging. It was simply attached with a few large screws. When I flipped it over, I saw that this wood was not a simple piece of plywood, but really nice glued together hardwood. So instead of making a new top for this, I thought I would use what I had. I wanted to make sure I had at least an inch lip all the way around the tabletop, so I took a quick measurement to see how much of the top I had to work with. The iron mounts on the top of the brackets were exactly 12 inches apart, so I wanted to get as much overhang as possible and still use this piece of wood. I decided that 14 inches would be just enough to give me that 1 inch width all the way around the top, and my cuts would be securely inside the half moon without having rounded corners. So I took my tape measure and I slid it across until the curve and the tape measure were exactly at 14 inches. I did this on both sides. Then I did a 14-inch mark in the center so I could use my square and draw a straight line. Now for the sides, I drew my horizontal lines where the line I just drew ended. This would give me a little bit more on the sides than my inch lip on the front and back, but I would be getting the maximum out of this piece of wood. Okay, call me lazy, but I did not want to spend a lot of time trying to sand off the paint on the other side of the table. So I thought I would just save time and run it through the planer. But my issue was that my planer will only take a 12-inch wide board. And my piece is now 14 inches. So since this is already a glued together board, I did not think it would hurt to cut it in half, plane it, and then glue it back together. So that's exactly what I did. I chose a seam between two pieces as close to the 7-inch mark as I could, and I drew a line down the center. I then went to the table saw and set my fence at exactly 7 inches. Cutting the entire piece at 7 inches twice would actually give me back the width of my saw blade that I would lose by cutting the outside length first. So I cut each at a 7-inch pass. Then I took my piece over to the miter saw. Now I had lines, but I wanted to make sure that what I lined up was the very edge or end of the straight edge to get as much out of my wood as possible. And just to save you time sanding later, and to make sure your pieces are exactly identical, I took the one I just cut and stacked it on the next piece. I used that piece to set my blade, and I made my cuts. This would ensure that my pieces would be identical in length. Now that I had two 7-inch pieces, I could easily run them through the planer. This would save me time having to sand a lot later and from possibly causing the surface to be uneven. It was at this point I could see the beauty of the wood that had been covered by the gray paint. With the wood planed, I now had to glue the pieces back together. So what I was trying to do here is match the pieces up the way that I cut them. Instead of just gluing them back together, I decided that I would also add some biscuits. Since this was a table and it was mounted to a cast iron base, I could foresee someone using the tabletop to pick up the piece while moving it, and that cast iron was very heavy, and I wanted to make sure my seam was as strong as the rest of the board. I laid out 5 biscuits evenly across the seam, and then as I removed them, I placed a pencil mark across both pieces of wood. From there, I took my biscuit joiner and I aligned each pencil mark to the center mark on my joiner, and I simply cut out my biscuit slots. Place wood glue in each slot, and then with a hammer, tap in your biscuits. Make sure they are perfectly centered aligned. After that, take the opposite side and place a bit of wood glue in each of those slots, and then cover the entire edge with glue and thin it out with your finger. You don't need a lot of glue, but you want to make sure all the wood is covered. Then place the boards together, and with your hammer again, tap the boards firmly into place and make sure the edges are aligned. Now with some clamps, squeeze your two pieces together. Make sure you place your clamps on opposing sides. This will prevent any possible bowing of the pieces if you clamp it too tight. Once dry, you can remove your clamps and do a light sanding to make sure you remove any glue and that the seams in the center between the two pieces are completely smooth. Also, try and sand out any nicks or marks that will detract from the beauty of the wood you just uncovered. I used a 220 and then a 320 grit sandpaper, but not much was needed after I had planed these two pieces. So just setting this back up on the iron frame, I was liking the way this was turning out, because up to this point, if refurbishing the old top did not work, I was prepared to start from scratch and build a completely new top. And at this point, looking at it, all I need to do is give it a nice edge. So using a simple roundover bit, I route the top edge of the table. Just the top edge, leave the bottom flat. You don't need to take too much off, just enough so you can clearly see that the edge is nice and rounded. I take some 400 grit sandpaper and I lightly touch up the edges that I just routed. 1. Look for any burn marks that were created by your router. You might not have these, but these are caused when your router speed is set too high, and I think I had mine just a tad bit too much. 2. Make sure that any part of the wood that was being cut against the grain is nice and smooth. You might not see this, but you can feel for it, and if you can feel it, hit it with the sandpaper. Now I needed to mount the table to the stand. Set your tabletop upside down and flip the stand on its head and place it on the tabletop. Using a ruler, make sure your stand is evenly spaced by measuring from the lip inward. Now, you might not think this step is a big deal and think, okay, I can screw it in, but I did notice on the old tabletop that the table had the screws pulled out of its surface once or twice, leaving large holes. And the owners probably just kept getting bigger threaded screws. So the weight of the base against the screws was a concern for me. When in the future the table is going to be moved, people will tend to pick up the table by the tabletop, and that's going to place a lot of strain on these screws. So I had to think of something else to keep this securely mounted in place. Once you have it perfectly centered, take a pencil and try to mark the exact center of each screw hole. So to overcome this dilemma and to give the top some added strength, I decided to use wood anchors. These have very large flat threads and once screwed in are very strong. And if you screw them down really tight, when you get to a certain point, it does not place any stress on the threads outside in the wood, but only on the inside where the threads are being pulled tight by the bolts. And when the top of the anchor comes in contact with the stand, it will no longer advance. So in order to do this, we need to drill some pilot holes. And since we already marked our bolt locations when we had the stand on the top of the table, we can now simply take a drill or a drill press and drill out the pilot holes. I placed the drill stopper 1/8 from penetrating through the tabletop. Then I place my laser in the center of each circle and drill out my pilot holes. With your pilot holes drilled out, take an Allen wrench and screw in your anchors. Most of the time, when you buy a set of screw anchors, they come in different sizes and they include an Allen wrench with the package. I actually saved these anchors when I took apart the bunk bed to convert it into a desk. Yes, I know I have an issue about throwing things away, and since I am making this up as I go along, I get to choose what leftovers from other projects that I get to include. So here are the screws that were previously with the table, and you can see the screw holes that I left in the bottom of the table. Now, with your anchors, you are going to need bolts. And for those of you who don't know the difference between a bolt and a screw, a bolt is a fastener with threads and a head that is intended and designed to be used or installed with a nut. And in this case, the anchor will act as our nut. Screws, on the other hand, are designed to be installed in a pre-drilled hole, or they are engineered to tap their own hole with the threading while being installed. The last step is nothing fancy. I just take some polyurethane and with a paper towel, I rub it onto the tabletop. After you allow enough time to dry, you can simply screw on your top to the base and you're all done. And that's how you flip a 1920 Singer sewing machine table into a nice nightstand. The owner was so pleased with the outcome of this flip that she opted to display it in her living room, right below this awesome mirror made from a simple pallet. So what do you think? How did it turn out? Would love to hear your comments below. As always, thanks for watching, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button.